Welcome back to the Christian Century on YouTube. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our writers, Marc Roscoe Loustau, who has written a brand new piece online for us that will also appear in the magazine about the most dangerous preacher in Hungary, as the article is called, a phrase straight out of the essay, but referring to the preacher and pastor Gábor Iványi. So we're going to be talking all about what's going on in Hungary. Before we dive into the article, though, Marc, welcome back. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to write for the Christian Century. I am a theologian, a cultural anthropologist. I did field work in Hungary and Romania, and I write broadly speaking about Eastern Europe and the overlap of religion and politics around here. And right now I'm based in Budapest, Hungary. I'm talking to you from Hungary.
Yeah, well, thanks for spanning the time difference to have this chat. Um, so this article I thought was really fascinating, and but our readers may not know much of the background of just what it's like in Hungary under Viktor Orban. I wondered if you could tell us a little more about just the religious landscape there. You mentioned in the article religious freedoms being threatened, forms of persecution. Could you just give us a sense of what it's like for religious groups and people in Hungary right now?
Absolutely. So, we've heard a lot over the past couple months in the US about Project 2025. And the real life inspiration for Project 2025 is Hungary. Um, I was really shocked, but also not shocked when Donald Trump uh, took special opportunity during the presidential debate a few weeks ago to praise Viktor Orban, who is the prime minister of Hungary, Hungary's authoritarian leader. The ties between Donald Trump and Hungary are very strong, as well as the ties between the extreme right wing in America and Hungary are very strong, and they've been very much cultivated by the Hungarian government and Viktor Orban. So if you really want to think about a real life horror show of Project 2025, it is currently Hungary. Um, the, uh, uh, the current religious landscape for Christian churches in Hungary is pretty much summed up by the phrase that the government has bought the churches. Um, the few churches that have stood up to the few church leaders who have stood up to Hungary's authoritarian turn, the turn towards extremist right wing politics, and kleptocracy. The government has basically been taken over by Orban's friends, and they are pillaging the public coffers for their own enrichment. The few Christian leaders who have stood up to this and criticized Orban's system are really on the margins of the established churches in Hungary. So the Catholic Church enjoys a large, the Catholic Church runs an extensive set of social service organizations that are largely funded by the government. Same with the Reformed Protestant or Calvinist Church. These are the two largest churches in Hungary, and they enjoy extreme largesse from the government in the name of providing social services to marginalized populations in the country. Um, and what that really amounts to is that the government has certainly bought them off. And so they, at risk of losing this funding mechanism through the government, they do not criticize the government for any of the government's decisions, any of the government's kleptocracy, any of the inequalities that exist in society that have been basically arranged by the government. The established churches keep quiet. And those who do stand up and criticize publicly, like, for instance, Reverend Gábor Iványi, are severely punished. And that's really what I was talking about in the article.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that a little more. Um, I have to say, one of the most fascinating little tidbits that you snuck into this article was this idea that Iványi and Orban used to be close. He baptized Orban's children. He did their wedding renewal. Um, I wonder if is there information out there? Are there theories out there about how these one-time associates or even friends became bitter enemies? Was there some kind of falling out? I just wonder if there's any light you can shed on that.
Absolutely. I would even go further and say, associates, friends, they were intimates. I mean, they were deeply, deeply close. Their family histories are deeply intertwined, and they knew each other. They ran in the same dissident circles against communism in the 1980s. They were both young men under communism. Gábor Iványi, his first church was a street corner. During late communism, he took the very radical and very courageous step to become a street preacher because he was so stridently opposed to the communist system. And the leaders of his denomination refused to give him a church because of that. Uh, and he was a very courageous figure, very public figure at that time, Gábor Iványi. And so he was running in the same circles as Orban, who was also an opponent of communism and a very public figure and dissident at that time. What's happened really is Orban has showed himself to be a very savvy, a very strategic political opportunist. And as he saw greater opportunities to enrich himself and his friends by taking a rightward turn, um, uh, since he was elected for a second term in office in 2010, he has now been in office ever since. He's now into his third term. Um, he basically took the government, turned it into a right wing ideas machine, a right wing extremist idea shop, and that has certainly captured the attention of right wing writers and intellectuals in the United States. But as he became even more opportunist, even more kleptocratic, even more cynical, you could say, Ivani just said, you know what? I'm going to live by my principles. I'm going to live by the truth of the Christian gospel. And that requires me to stand up and break with this former intimate, to criticize him publicly. And that, in the end, is really what produced the break in their relationship and has produced this now 15-year long experience of persecution by the government against Ivani.
Wow. Yeah. The one of the big themes, particularly near the end of the essay, is about American solidarity with Hungarian Christians like Iványi and his church. Um, and he wishes the American Christians were more supportive. But I wonder what that support would look like. What could, if even if readers of this article were moved and said, I want to stand in solidarity with Iványi and his church, are there even ways to do that? And you had mentioned to me before we started recording, there have even been some important updates on the situation since you first wrote the article. So could you maybe tell us, do you even see ways for solidarity to happen at this point between Americans and the Hungarian church?
So in the article, I talk about kind of one of our intellectual misconceptions, a cultural stereotype that many liberal Protestants have about Europe and the European Union as this bastion of human rights, and that if there are folks who are suffering from violations of human rights, they're certainly not going to be liberal Protestants or Protestant Christians, because they were the ones who were instrumental. Liberal Protestants were the ones who were instrumental in setting up the entire EU system of human rights to begin with. So, if there's going to be anybody who's suffering, who's on the outskirts or the margins of the system of European human rights, it's going to be the others of liberal Protestantism, not liberal Protestants themselves. Well, I think that's something that we absolutely need to disabuse ourselves of, because Orban's system is persecuting liberal Protestants today, and they are persecuting Gábor Iványi specifically. But the details of that and my argument about that is in the article. The update to talk about is that really the end game for Iványi, the end game for Iványi's church, which is called the Hungarian Evangelical Fellowship. In Hungarian, the acronym is MET. It's a Methodist offshoot. He belongs to the Wesleyan tradition, Iványi does, and his church does. The end game has arrived. The government, just over the last month, has shut down Iványi's network of schools that serve mostly the highly oppressed Roma minority in Hungary, and also his homeless shelters. These have now basically gone under. They've closed or they've been taken over by the government. Even if American Christians wanted to help, they can't. They legally can't because the government has frozen the bank accounts of Iványi's schools and Iványi's homeless shelters. So even if you wanted to donate some money, the money would go straight into the government's own coffers. You literally can't financially help Iványi in this moment. So that's the kind of extreme endpoint that the persecution has now reached. The government has decided that it's not going to play around anymore, and the church, as Iványi's church, as it has been practiced, his faith as he has practiced it, is now over for the foreseeable future. And that's just happened in the last 2 weeks. There was a protest that was organized here in Budapest just on Friday to protest the government's actions against Iványi, and he stood up in front of a crowd of 3,000 people, and he said, there is persecution of Christians happening in Hungary today. And it's a very courageous statement to make. But really, as it should be, and the focus was on, during the protest, on the people who are suffering the most, and that is the families of the school children who are not going to be able to receive the quality education that they were counting on through Iványi's schools. And a number of parents of children got up and spoke about the trauma that they're experiencing and the question of who's going to provide the necessary services to our children to let them grow up to feel a sense of self-respect in their culture as Roma. That is now, that's now, who knows? Who knows what's going to happen to those children and what kind of education they're going to get.
Wow. Well, that's a grim update, but thank you for sharing that with us. You mentioned certain expectations of like the EU being subverted, and I think of my own growing up, the specter of Christian persecution. It was always that some godless secular left-wing regime would be persecuting Christians around the world, and to think that it's these sort of ostensibly pro-Christian right-wing authoritarian movements that actually are doing it. Um,
It's a weird reversal of our expectations. Absolutely.
mhm.
And I think that's one of the big messages to get across, and I've tried to get across in this article, is that if we think that the real enemy of truthful Christian faith is godless communism or secular authorities, in Hungary it's the mirror image,
Mm.
and if we're going to take action in some way, that is an understanding that we need to somehow get across in our own minds.
Yeah. Well, thank you for helping us gain some of that understanding with this piece. Anyone out there who has not yet read this article, the link to the article will be below in the video description. We'll also have the link to Mark's Substack. He had mentioned that protests that happened recently, there is going to be exclusive content about that protest in the Substack, so you can check that out below as well. Mark, thanks so much for joining us to chat today.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Christian Century and Christian Century's readers for drawing attention to this important topic.